There is a very good argument to be made that a patient engagement professional has to be unreasonable.
Hi, I'm Caitlin,
And I'm Clarinda, and this is Not Just Patients.
a podcast where we break barriers to meaningful patient involvement in healthcare.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. Our guest on this episode is Emma Sutcliffe, and she's here to talk to us about professionalizing patient engagement.
Emma is one of the most cited and published experts in the field of patient engagement and patient sciences. Her most recent industry role was as the Global Patient Officer at Ipsen, where she managed a patient champion network of 150 colleagues and partnerships with 260 patient organizations for 3 therapeutic franchises. In 2024, Emma founded ISPEP, the International Society for Patient Engagement Professionals, which became the biggest organization to align and elevate patient engagement practices in the sector. Emma holds several board trustee positions with rare disease patient organizations and her scientific pedigree as a medical biochemist, and she recently added to her clinical skill set by qualifying as a psychotherapist and counselor. Thank you so much for joining us today, Emma.
Oh, thanks for having me. I love that bio sketch. I want to be that person. Oh, I am that person. That's lovely.
So just to start with, Emma, we'd love to know a little bit more about your story and your journey into patient engagement.
Absolutely. So actually, I started out wanting to do medical research, bench research, and I wanted to focus on probably neurosciences research, so stroke-based mechanisms and that kind of thing. And I was en route to start my PhD, and I just had that moment when I realized I'm absolutely rubbish in a lab. So there's no point in me pursuing a career as a bench researcher. However, I adore medical science and I absolutely love, understanding how diseases happen and the medical science and the development of medicines. But it wasn't going to be me contributing to medical science from a
Mhm,
lab.
mhm.
What I then did was I didn't really know what to do. I walked away from a PhD and then thought, well, I'm just going to do something that I find interesting until I find what it is I truly want to do.
Mhm.
And I applied for a job with a medical film company as a fact checker. And that led me into the field of medical communications. And
Mhm.
I started working straight away with a company called MSD, who were developing a medicine to treat people living with HIV.
Mhm.
And that was all I knew. I was hooked. Then it was absolutely all I've ever done is work with patients and patient groups and communicate their needs in the development of medicines. So basically, because I'm really rubbish as a researcher, it gives me
Mhm.
a huge appreciation for the complexity of developing a medicine.
That's a very interesting story, Emma. And funnily enough, it is very similar to my own in some ways because I have a background of master's in biotechnology and I knew that I did not want to be in a lab. Then, after I finished my master's, I came across an ad for a job that said, do you love English and do you love science? And I actually ended up in science communication in a company that does science and medical communications. And so my journey into this field started very similarly in medical communications. And then, because of my lived experience as a patient, it kind of segued into patient engagement. So that's what led us here. And it's quite nice to have that overlap with you.
Oh,
So,
thank you. That's nice to hear. I mean, I was really interested in I was interested in the PhD that was offered.
Mhm.
And it was part of contributing. It wasn't to stroke pathophysiology, but it was ironically, we're seeing a resurgence of the Ice Bucket Challenge, right, for ALS. So I'd done undergraduate research in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis,
Mhm.
and I absolutely adored all the write-up, all the communication, the
Right,
thesis,
right.
and continuing to look at different. I think it was taurine release from various inhibitors, and I thought I just can't do it. I literally felt constrained. It was like a physical thing as well as a psychological thing. As
Mm,
in, I need to be out there and communicating, all
mm,
these disease mechanisms and how we help find new medicines. So I literally could not physically be in a lab. It just wasn't going to happen for me. I had such an excitement and such an energy that was bursting out of me that I had to do something with people, not with test tubes. I think it's
Yeah. So yeah, it's lovely to have this connection in this way. And now that we're all here as patient engagement professionals, let's talk about patient engagement. And let's start by defining it a little bit for our listeners. I mean, this whole podcast is really about patient engagement, patient involvement in healthcare at a broad level. But for the purpose of this conversation, how are you defining patient engagement? And more specifically, is there a distinction between patient advocacy and patient engagement that you see?
there is a distinction, and I'm really happy to address it. And I'm going to be really candid with you. And, I've had this question over and over and over again. And in my last industry role, I was getting this question over and over and over again. And I thought, do you know what? I'd just been to the Institute of Managing Directors in Lausanne on a week-long course. And during that course, it had been highlighted to us just, how useful AI is in terms of answering questions and allowing you to then think about other things and save you time in that creative process.
Mhm.
So I thought, I'm going to run an experiment here. I'm going to ask ChatGPT what the difference is between, actually, I asked about patient affairs and patient advocacy. And
Mhm.
ChatGPT came back with a magnificent set of answers. And I actually presented that to our executive leadership team to say, you guys keep asking me what the work is of patient affairs and what the work is of patient advocacy under the umbrella of we're all practicing some type of patient engagement. And here's the answer. And the ELT were like, this is the greatest
Mhm.
and the most sensible differentiation we've ever encountered. So I think the answer to that is coming from ChatGPT. But to be serious, patient engagement is the activity that we do. We are all engaging with patients in one way or another. So I see patient advocacy as the work that people do within healthcare systems, often external to industry, and patient affairs within an organization. They are managing, the development of an asset through the pipeline, and they are engaging with patients as part of the role of patient affairs to make sure clinical trial design is patient informed, patient directed, to make sure that the experience of participating in the clinical trial is appropriate, safe, and to ensure that patient experience data is gathered from clinical trials. So we put it quite simply in my last role, patient engagement is what we all do. The patient advocacy teams manage relationships and healthcare systems outside of the organization, and patient affairs are in medical affairs and R&D, and they manage appropriate patient engagement for asset development and clinical trial participation. So I've always found those two to be very helpful. I think one of the challenges is, what is the role of a chief patient officer in any kind of organization, in an advocacy group, in a biotech, med devices, big pharma, little pharma? Actually, the role of the chief patient officer is to make sure that good patient engagement is taking place, whichever department you're in, whichever part of the organization you represent, whatever your individual discipline is. The CPO is kind of like the headmistress, I suppose, to make sure that every part of the organization is behaving appropriately. And actually, in my last role, I did have both roles. I was global head of patient affairs, which is very much the R&D and asset development in medical affairs. And I was also the global patient officer, which is that overseeing role. And I am very strong in my belief that every organization should have a CPO, whatever the title is. It doesn't have to have chief in it. It's not about, it's not about seniority, but everybody should have a patient officer that oversees all practices.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense for organizations not to have a global patient officer. The challenge that we have is, where does that officer come from? And my challenge on that is, does it really matter? Because whether you come from, strength and depth in patient advocacy, strength and depth in patient affairs, strength and depth in policy or access, you will be lacking in the other set of disciplines. So as a patient officer, you're always going to be an expert in one subject and learning from experts in other subjects.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of debate about should, people from patient advocacy groups and people from patient organizations, should they be able to be a global patient officer? And the answer to that is, of course, they should be able to. Should they be able to be in patient affairs, answering into the chief medical officer, when a scientific and medical scientific background is essential for the work of that department? That's a trickier ask, because certainly, if you're in a medical affairs leadership team as the patient affairs head, you will have to sign contracts and you will have to sign to say that you have an ability to step up if that chief medical officer is,
Unavailable or
something else. Yeah. So it would be very difficult for somebody without a scientific understanding of how drugs are developed to be able to be in medical affairs. So I think we have lots of debate, but I think we're kind of confusing what's involved as head of patient affairs and what the role is of a patient officer. So I'm really excited when I see roles coming through, like chief patient experience officer. And I think, I can't remember the company, but Jane Bershkovitz, I think I pronounced her name incorrectly there, but, we do see roles of chief patient advocate. So I'm actually really delighted that we are opening up the possibilities of what these roles could and should be. And I think certainly in the future, we're going to see a lot more genuine integration in the everyday level of these different roles.
right. Yeah, so I think that there are two thoughts that come to my mind. One is that overall, in the context of this conversation, when we are referring to patient engagement, we are broadly talking about pharma companies. And I'm making that very specific for our listeners because on this podcast, we talk about patient involvement more broadly across different touch points in the health system more broadly. So we are talking about patient engagement within pharma. And the other point that you made about patient organizations or other representatives from outside pharma potentially getting into those roles, that's really interesting because I think traditionally pharma has typically promoted or hired or advanced people who are born and brought up within pharma. And I think there has been almost an aversion, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, to bringing in people who have not who don't necessarily have that background, and understandably so because of all the regulations and compliance issues that might be associated. But are you seeing a shift in that perspective as well, or that willingness to go beyond that pharma circle that's typically the space that's looked at?
Well, companies, let's be really candid here. The role of a pharma company is to deliver medicines. Is a business model. So
Yeah.
it's in their interest, of course, to have a business model that allows and is driven by patient needs. So this is why, the FDA created patient-focused drug development, several years ago. And we're seeing the tightening and expectations and clarification around what patient-focused drug development looks like from a business perspective, not just from a generic nice to do. So, pharma being a business will, of course, follow the regulators' guidelines to ensure that their assets get a license. They are fit for purpose. The other part of that is it's good business to engage with people who use your products and services. So whichever business angle you look at it from, pharma needs to absolutely have systematic organizational integration of patient-focused drug development practices. So whichever business you're coming at, whichever business model you're coming at, you need to have patient-focused drug development. However, they are also a business, and their business is to develop assets. That is a very different remit from the role of patient advocacy groups and patient organisations who are absolutely brilliant and must keep pushing for change in healthcare systems, change in health literacy, change in diagnostic pathways, all of those kind of things. So, the roles are, of course, they're partnership roles, but they are very different roles. And actually, patient organisations are in the business now of evidence-based advocacy. So what I really like is that we're seeing a strengthening in the acceptance, the need, and the impact of both disciplines, patient-focused drug development and also evidence-based advocacy. So we just get stronger and stronger by the day. And I'm more interested in the strengths than the weaknesses. We need to overcome the challenges without competing for, which is better. Ultimately, so long as patients receive good, solid care and support, we can achieve both.
Yeah.
That's something amazing that we'd love to all strive for, I think.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, going back a little bit to professionalizing patient engagement. For a long time, I think patient engagement may be viewed as something as sort of passion work, and often may be done on a charity or volunteer basis, particularly patients who may be engaging with the pharmaceutical companies. But there has been a shift towards professionalizing this kind of work. So could you tell us a bit about the movement towards professionalizing patient engagement and why this shift has happened?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I come from a relatively luxurious background, I think, because my first project, like I said, was working to develop a medicine to treat people living with HIV, as a treatment for people with HIV. And so that's all I knew, that patient activism, not even it was advocacy, to the power of a gazillion. So, I was working with patient activist groups to develop those medicines. And we honestly, we just tore up the rule books. We were just like, we need to get this medicine. We need to get it to people. We need to do it now. We've got to address stigma. We've got to address surrogate markers. There's so many gaps in our collective knowledge that there's no time to reflect, is it a passion project? Is it something that just needs to get done? So, that was my, literally a baptism of fire. So all I knew from, first stepping into medicine development was this absolute ultra focused determination to develop medicines that would help people who were dying. And I can still remember when the data was faxed, because we were still using fax machines. This is 1996. And I can still remember when the data for the impacts of the medicine on viral load came back to us. And just seeing though, honestly, I could cry. Seeing those words, viral load undetectable, was just astonishing.
Yeah.
And it didn't really matter at that moment in time. It didn't matter where you were from, what your organization was. It didn't really matter, what your salary was, or it didn't matter, where in the world you were. We had something that would stop people dying. And it's just incredible. And I literally, saw colleagues in the pharma company. I saw colleagues who were medics. I saw colleagues in European AIDS treatment group. We were just collectively in awe of this milestone moment. And you can hear my voice breaking. I'm determined to never forget that. So if that is described as a passion project, if that is described as unprofessional and tearing up the rule books, then so be it. But what we have seen is we are coming back to that absolute commitment to, it doesn't matter your title, it doesn't matter your background, we need to have better impact for people. And if you keep that as your core value, professionalization will come through. Now, technically, I just formed a society for patient engagement professionals. And the reason for doing that was because I spent a lot of 2003, 2004 hearing from peers, colleagues, friends in patient engagement, long-time practitioners, new practitioners, the same level of knowledge and expertise and enthusiasm, and they were just losing their jobs. It just became too easy for an organization to let go of their patient engagement professionals. And it just didn't make any sense to me. And, what I realized was we've been so busy and so focused and so committed to doing our work that we'd forgotten to look after ourselves. So this is where the concept of PEP was born. It was literally, we need to, protect ourselves, and we need to explain what the role is of a patient engagement professional, and we need to help integrate and make this role absolutely integral in all of our health systems. So that's where it came from. And it has been genuinely quite a shock to me when people have said, oh, we so need this, and it needs to happen, and I can't believe it didn't exist, and it needed to come to fruition, and it's been fast growing, and it's been remarkable. But that's because we actually are professionals all day, every day, doing our work. And so we will get practices, we will get, formal job careers and job progression and all those kinds of things will come. But the first thing we need to do is realize our strength, our expertise as a community, a global community of experts. So it's amazing to be a part of that. And I very much see that my role is to help create this community and then leave. I want to make a quiet exit. I actually want to focus on full-time counselling, and I want to step aside from pharma. And that is a natural way that things should evolve. You do your bit, and when you've done what you can do, you then let the next people take the reins and move things forward. That's what should happen, and hopefully that's what will happen with this PEP.
Yeah, I can completely relate to what you said in terms of the feedback that you received, that this is so needed, because I felt like that. I felt the first time I saw you reached out to me saying, would you like to join? I was like, yes, where has this been all my life? I mean, all my life is relative because I've been a patient engagement professional for a couple of years, but I'm the only UPATI patient expert in India. So that's a lonely place to be. I have the UPATI community, but they're all so far away. So in general, and patient engagement professionals are few and far between, but it is a strong community. It is a passionate community, and coming together, the strength is just multiplied. So it really helps to have that community to learn from. And so thank you for that initiative. I benefit from it personally, and I know that a lot of other people do.
It's our initiative, though, isn't it, Clarinda? It's not, we
It
all
is.
own it. It's why I find it quite interesting, and I find it quite sad at the moment that there's a little bit of I understand it from the psychological perspective that people who are patients, people who've experienced, a medical incident, medical emergency, or adapting to life with a long-term medical condition, the psychotherapist part of me understands that there is a need for those experiences and feelings to be validated. The business part of me also understands that we need to bake those experiences into how we develop medicine so that the medicine is fit for purpose. And I can hold both of those needs in my right hand. And in my left hand, I'm quite sad that there seems to be a challenge to the patient engagement professional community that if you're not a patient, or if you're not declaring that you're a patient, then what gives you the authority to speak on behalf of patients? And I've noticed this is happening quite a bit lately, and I'm quite confused by it because I don't really understand why, you would have to be perhaps overt about a medical condition you may or may not have, a caregiving role you may or may not have, because if you're doing the professional job of a patient engagement professional, then there is an expectation around what that role is. So I find it quite confusing when there's almost a criticism that if you're not openly, publicly declaring I am a patient, or I have this, or I'm a caregiver, then I have this, then I find that a little bit of a sidetrack. I think it deflects us from the work that we need to do to make sure that patient-focused medicine development is an actuality and operational, and not just, a tick box exercise. So I don't know how you guys find that, because of course, if you scratch the surface of most people, they will have some sort of, maybe a caregiving role, or maybe they are patient themselves, but not everybody wants to publicly disclose that. And I don't think it should detract us from the work that we do. So I'm watching that kind of conversation going on, and I'm kind of studying it, thinking, what's my position on this? Maybe I'm wrong. I think it's always appropriate for us as professionals to question our understanding and say we might be getting this wrong. And I think it's a joy of ISPEP that we can question of each other. But one of the founding principles for ISPEP was always challenge kindly, challenge respectfully, challenge with the background perspective that I might not have this right, I might well be ignorant, but I'm going to listen and respect somebody else's opinion. So I'm kind of watching that with a bit of sadness, if I'm honest, as in, is it a case of my illness is more worthy than your illness? And I don't really like that conversation. One of the leaders that I work with, who I'm always inspired by, I'm not going to give you her name because, she's provided personal kind of mentoring for me, and I want to be respectful of that. But when she was a therapeutic area head in a pharma company, she really thought, sorry, a global head, she really thought very hard about not having kind of therapy area competition. She worked really hard with various patient organizations to say, let's not get into that game of, cancer is worse than Alzheimer's disease, or Alzheimer's disease is worse than migraine. She was like, let's approach this in a therapeutic agnostic way, and let's look at how we deliver better medicines for all patients with better patient engagement practices. And I think that's very interesting. However, I do appreciate that if you're living with a rare condition, an ultra rare condition, and industry isn't perhaps doing the research because it's not as much of a business investment or a return on investment, then that is a really tough set of circumstances to have. So I'm always trying to come at any challenge with the mindset of ignorance. Like, I probably know very little about this. So as far as people challenging people's pedigree and credentials to be a patient engagement professional, I'm kind of watching that discussion and thinking, how is this going to unfold, and what am I missing because I just don't get this, this kind of patient competition, as it were.
I think you touched on a lot there, Emma, that resonated with me. And again, I'm happy to share my experiences and thoughts on it, but just as part of the discussion, and again, happy if people disagree and are wrong. And I think that's what's great about, having an ISPEP community, and also what we're really trying to do on this podcast as well, to have these discussions. So firstly, with regards to what you said about patient engagement professionals needing to be a patient or a carer, that's certainly something that I've experienced. So similarly to you and yourself and Clarinda, I am a medical communications professional. I've worked in agencies, and I got really interested in patient engagement work. And I found that while I was working really hard in that area, there was a complete switch in how people listened to me, responded to me when they found out that I was a patient. And that kind of led me to essentially having to come out as a patient and talk about my, medical history, how my disease impacts me, etc., in a professional environment, which for several years I decided I didn't want to do. And I'm comfortable with that now, but it was certainly something I felt like I had to do to be taken more seriously in patient engagement. And I can see now, no matter how much experience I say I have, as soon as I say that I myself am a patient, people turn around and listen. So I can see how it could be frustrating for someone who doesn't have maybe that personal experience to not be taken as seriously, because in the end, what we really want, as you've again said, is that everyone should be taking patient engagement seriously. Everyone in a pharmaceutical business, for example, should be thinking about it and caring about it. So we shouldn't gatekeep being a patient engagement professional for people who are patients.
Absolutely.
And yeah, sure, they can provide. I think there is a unique perspective that comes with being a patient or a carer yourself, but that doesn't mean, I think it's good to have diverse perspectives and have someone on the team who can speak to not having the personal experience, but seeing it from the outside, bringing people who haven't got personal experience in. They have other skill sets and experiences that are extremely valuable that aren't lived experience, but people with lived experience are also really valuable. So I think, of course, you need empathy, you need some experience, but I don't think you should have to have lived experience of being a patient or carer to be involved.
Absolutely agree. And the corollary, the other side of that as well is I was pretty insistent when I was, in my last industry role, I suppose, when people would say, shall we bring a patient in? And I would be saying, and the purpose of that would be because we aren't bringing, they're not performers. We're not asking people to come in and, if we're just asking people to come in because we want to be inspired, then that's actually treating that person as if they're there to help us to do our job better. And actually, we should just want to do our job better because we want to do our job to the best of our ability. So I would actually get quite frustrated when patients were brought in and it was a tick box exercise and it was to say, well, we've spoken to a patient. And I would be saying, but what we do as patient engagement professionals is we are translating. We are translating complex medical science or clinical trial protocols to patients. We are translating patient need, patient experience, patient unmet needs back to our industry colleagues and our research colleagues. So we are literally the professional bridge between these two parties' interests. And I think the strongest individual skill that a patient engagement professional brings to those interactions is that empathy piece that you touched upon, but also that empathy from industry's perspective. Industry can be quite frightened and they can be developing an asset that doesn't make it through, and then somebody has to communicate that back to the patient organizations. And I've personally experienced, the outrage, the despair, the anger, the sadness, those human emotions when a medicine is removed or a license isn't given, and it's a drug is approved in one part of the world and not approved in the other part of the world. And then a patient or a patient organization will be afraid, like, have I been taking a medicine that's not fit for purpose? So, the patient engagement professional is in the middle of all of that, helping all parties to communicate, to make sense of what's going on. So, your role as a communication specialist is absolutely needed in this arena. So I think, again, it's about coming at it from the perspective of, what can I do here from my professional skill set, from my personality, and from what drives me to just have an impact and make things better. And I'm a really massive believer in small acts. Small acts. Whenever someone says, "Oh, we can't do that," or "It's too difficult to do that," it absolutely motivates me to go, but we can make some small change, and eventually enough small changes will lead to a big change. So, let's not just say we can't do it because it's difficult. Let's say it's difficult, so how do we do it? And I think that's what we're seeing with patient engagement professionals. Like, we've been challenged on what we do. And the more examples, the more we share, the more we respect each other's backgrounds and different case studies, the better our practices are, the more we are recognised for what we do, the bigger the budgets we get, the better and more projects we can do for patients. Absolutely. So it's self-fulfilling, really, isn't it? And one of my greatest pleasures for working in industry. And actually, I'm a bit more comfortable in that independent role, to be honest. I actually like being independent and able to kind of challenge all parties. But one of my greatest pleasures was being able to take, my patient affairs budget from 2% of the medical affairs budget to 3%.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's an achievement. Yeah.
Sounds like a small percentage, but even being able to say to my then chief medical officer and line manager, look, I'm actually just going to ask for 3% of the budget. What was it last year? 2%? Okay, let's go. So you
Yeah.
have to pick your script and you have to be resilient and you have to just keep saying, I am going to find a way through this challenge. I'm going to find a way through this challenge. And that's what we want to do in ISPEP. We want to share those examples so we all get to do the best that we can with the work that we have.
Yeah. I love it. I love the entire ethos that you're bringing into this idea of patient engagement and how the approach should be, because the truth is that it is growing or a relatively new in pharma companies. Honestly, a lot of pharma companies don't even have it yet. And whenever you're starting something new, you are going to be up against it. And that's just the attitude you have to bring, right? You're up against marketing and commercial and regulatory that have been around for as long as pharma has been around, and you just have to like dig your heels in and say that we're here for it and we'll take the 1% jump. That's like a huge achievement. So I think that that's the perfect attitude to have. So thank you for that perspective, Emma.
I was in a patient summit a couple of weeks ago and I heard a presentation and I noted it down. And I love post-it. So I noted it down on a post-it and it's right in front of me right now. And it was actually be unreasonable.
Yeah.
There is a very good argument to be made that a patient engagement professional has to be
Yeah.
unreasonable because you are going against practices, you are change champions. You've got to stand in front of various different people and you've got to be unreasonable from their perspective because you're being more than reasonable on behalf of patients. And the other thing I wrote down from that summit was enjoy the privilege. So, you, me, we, the ISPEP community, we're a strong community and we grow in strength. And we need to start to recognize that we are privileged to be in that community because, we are being supported by our peers to be unreasonable. And we need to then enjoy that privilege because that privilege gives us the strength to keep pushing for change. And those are the only two notes I wrote down from that summit on my post-it. It's like, actually, it is professional of us to be unreasonable on behalf of patients.
Yeah. So I'd like to move on a little bit and talk about some of the challenges that patient engagement professionals face. One of the big ones you mentioned, for example, is in the current climate, one of the easiest things to do is to axe entire patient engagement teams. They're the first teams to go when a clinical trial fails or various things like that when there are budget cuts. That is one challenge. Another big challenge that we hear about very frequently is compensation, really the lack of it rather, for patient engagement professionals. A lot of patient engagement professionals, and this ties back to the idea that a lot of the work is seen as passion work, and there have been barriers to compensation for many reasons, especially when patients are brought in to advise or serve on advisory groups or committees or things like that to pharma. So, can you talk a little bit about the challenges, especially around the compensation challenge?
I think the challenges around compensation, there are two types of challenge on this. First of all, so if a person is an expert in their lived experience or their medical experience, then, most pharma companies are moving towards having a fair market value SOP. And certainly the last organization I worked in, which was a medium-sized pharma, the teams there worked very hard to have an FMV policy. And it was integrated across all the work that we did with patient organizations, patient experts, patient groups. And it actually became a standard practice. And once it was decided, it's about the mindset shift. Once it was decided that we will have fair market value and fair compensation in the way that we would, pay an HCP for their services, then the implementation of that was quite straightforward. So it starts from that mindset challenge. The second part is the challenge around, I suppose, compensation for the role for the patient engagement professional. So this is again where we know what the career pathway is for a medical director. We know what the career pathway is for a physician in various healthcare systems. So as soon as we have a professional pathway for a patient engagement professional, then fair market value will follow. So I think there's two parts to it. Somebody being compensated for the service or expertise they provide to an organization, and then somebody doing the role of a patient engagement professional with, set salary and reimbursement. I think there's two separate issues. And I think we are relatively well developed in terms of paying experts for their time and experience and expertise. And we're just at the start of formalising career pathways for patient engagement professionals. So watch this space, because it's something ISPEP intends to really, to take a leadership piece on.
Yeah, great. I kind of seen a lot of people talk about both of those challenges actually from the patient expert kind of side of it. I think it's a lot about sort of compliance, and a pharmaceutical company that you may be working with having those processes in place, as you say, to be able to fairly and compliantly compensate experts. And I think hopefully that's something that's moving, but it's also having those processes be easy enough for patients to engage with pharmaceutical companies. We're talking about a lot of paperwork and issues, and I think sometimes that can be quite a big barrier to getting the work done if people don't have the time to have those processes, policies, paperwork in place. And then the second piece you spoke about with regards to patient engagement professionals who work at a pharmaceutical company, something I've always found interesting is that you very rarely see anyone with a more junior patient engagement role. A lot of people either come from, working in a medical communications agency, for example, or working in pharma, not in a patient engagement role, and then going kind of straight to either global head of patient engagement or head of patient engagement for a country or a franchise, but not people kind of building their career from the ground up in patient engagement. So that's something that's interesting and great to hear that ISPEP are looking into that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a vitally lacking area. And like I said a bit earlier, we've just spent so much time doing the work that we've actually not looked after ourselves. And that's what the pathway is about. So we are seeing some of the academic groups. KCL has a great masters. Cambridge actually has a really good masters on pharmaceutical pathways, and within those there are modules on patient engagement. So we start seeing it integrated. One of the things that we are really keen to do within ISPEP, and we're trying to figure out what our space is so we're not duplicating or wasting time and effort, around creating capability skill sets, which is actually around those more junior roles. How do you progress your career as a patient engagement professional? So not the theory of patient engagement, because there are enough people around to talk about that now, and we're seeing, it's fantastic, we're seeing something every single day around patient engagement practices. It's fantastic. We're seeing PFMD are publishing profusely. We're seeing UPATI doing publications. We're seeing we just did an ISPEP paper about patient engagement in pharmaceutical companies. So those big pieces continue, but you're absolutely right. What about the skill set? What about the career pathway? So we've been working with the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, and we've been working with the guys at KCL. We're talking to the people at Cambridge. We're talking to people like Professor Lara Bloom to say, what kind of training course or certification program would you like ISPEP to lead on? And we very much do feel it's around, how do we incubate? How do we help? How do we train people in those professional roles?
Mhm.
And do we have a job description for someone coming straight out of university or, whatever, to say, I want to have a career as a patient engagement professional? And we'll get there. But it's important that we do the discovery to find out what people will find the most helpful.
Mhm.
Right, right. Super. Thank you so much, Emma. This has been really, really insightful. And we've managed to cover a lot of ground in the time that we've had, and it's been a really insightful
Mhm.
conversation. So thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
For the last couple of minutes, we'd just love to get your advice, which is usually a piece that we ask all our guests. So, first, your advice for patient advocates looking to become more established as professionals in the space.
Okay, so my advice for someone specializing in patient advocacy to consider a career as a patient engagement professional is, first of all, just to acknowledge that you already are a patient engagement professional, but your area of expertise is in advocacy. So my recommendation would be to do your research. Find out what kind of patient engagement roles exist. Look at what your skill sets are, and do you match those roles? If there's a role for which that you'd like to do, but you don't have the skill sets, then reach out to your peers, get yourself on training programs, speak to people, listen to a pep talk. You've got lots of career pathways in there. And
Mhm.
yes, I would say join ISPEP. It's not for profit. Get a membership. Speak to people who are in all kinds of areas of patient engagement, and practice. There is nothing wrong with saying, I'd actually like to earn some experience on this. Sometimes that will be paid for internship or experience, sometimes it won't. But there are a lot of opportunities out there, and the ISPEP community vociferously shares those opportunities because we want patient engagement to be a profession that people are proud to be a part of.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma.
Sorry, that became a bit of a Braveheart speech at the end.
Absolutely loved it. And yeah, I think for people out there, knowing that there is a profession to go into, knowing they have the experience and the skill set, and it's just learning a bit more about the space. And there are lots of initiatives that are out there to support people in professionalizing their patient engagement work. So that's really inspiring and helpful. And just want to say, yeah, I think the work that you're doing is amazing and will help lots of different people in the space. And it's great to have this community.
Thank you.
So I'll just tell you a really quick story. When I was traveling for the UPATI graduation, I was asked at immigration what I'm traveling for, and it was impossible to explain and what I am and what I do. But I just think that work like what you're doing, it makes it possible that within the next few years, people know that what patient engagement is, and that is such a lovely goal to imagine that people can say that we are patient engagement professionals and people get it eventually.
And, be unreasonable. Enjoy being a PEP, because, it's a privilege that we've all earned and our predecessors have earned. I was just editing a pep talk actually with Michaela de Boeck, who's head of patient engagement at Novartis. And she compares it to the suffragettes, where her 14-year-old son, I think he's 14, had said to her, Mum, I can't believe it. Like, until as recent as 100 years ago, women were not allowed to vote. And that was incomprehensible to him. And Michaela very much is like, that's how patient-focused medicine development should be. We should all be going, can you believe it? Can you believe that patients are involved in the way that we develop medicines? And she says when she's feeling a bit low, she thinks about the suffragette movement, and it was deeds, not words. Keep doing it, be unrelenting, be unreasonable. And I think that is actually what a PEP does. We are relentless, and we will carry on doing the work of patient engagement so that we get to a place when, I've actually got teenagers who are a bit older than 15, but then maybe my grandchild at 15 is saying, can you imagine it, Granny, that actually medicine used to get developed
Yeah,
without
exactly.
without without patient input. And actually,
Uh-huh.
you were one of the people that made sure that that was outlawed. So, I think that's a
Amazing.
place we all need to get to, that we just say, well, we ensure patient-focused medicine development happens. End.
Wonderful. A patient engagement suffragette.
Deeds, not words.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that great advice and for this whole conversation. It's been so great to learn a little bit more about professionalising patient engagement, and we're really excited to see what you do with the ISPEP Hub. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.
So Clarinda, for the last few minutes then, it would be great to get an idea of your key takeaways from our conversation with Emma.
So I think that to start off, the definition of a patient engagement professional is one that all of us have probably spent some time thinking about, and it's not a universally accepted one, but it's something that we discussed a bit in this conversation. On the one hand, you could say that anybody who has made it their mission to improve the lives of patients and who's working towards that, whether it is in an advocacy group or within a pharma company, or perhaps even working with a regulator, in an advisory capacity, if you are working with the intention of improving patients' lives, technically you're engaging patients and technically you are a patient engagement professional. But speaking purely from patient engagement as a career, then in the context of this conversation with Emma, we were talking from the perspective of patient engagement within pharma, because that's where patient engagement functions exist and there are more clearly defined roles. So that overall context was helpful just to set the scene for this conversation.
Yeah, agree. And I think what was interesting, because we were speaking about pharma, is there were quite a few nice links to our episode that we did actually a year ago this month with Bronwyn Lewis, who was working as in patient engagement at Boehringer Ingelheim at the time. And in that conversation, she spoke about the role of someone in the patient engagement function, the value of it both to pharma and to society and patients as well. So would really recommend listening back to that. But we also discussed a little bit about the challenges involved in the role. And I think we discussed a lot of these today with Emma. So it's interesting to hear that they both had this perspective. So a few of those challenges include the fact that there isn't really a set career path to kind of get into patient engagement. There's not a clear kind of professional development. There's not a clear consensus. And actually, there's a bit of controversy about whether you should have lived experience yourself versus having experience in pharma. It's a function that maybe is not prioritized, not given enough budget. It's not even a role in every pharmaceutical company in the world.
Right.
There's a range in how they're integrated into the rest of the company and how mandatory their processes are. There aren't necessarily set processes and frameworks. So quite a lot of this was brought up by both Bronwyn and Emma. And this is why something like ISPEP is needed. So this is the society that Emma has set up to help people who are in this position get a community and speak to each other about these issues.
Yeah, and it's lovely to see that evolution has happened. You could say since our last conversation with Bronwyn and this conversation, and in a matter of a year, it seems like great progression, you could say, for this whole field and for professionalizing patient engagement as a whole. And I think that we can all attest to the need for communities like ISPEP, because we've personally experienced that sense of community through UPATI. There are other groups like PFMD that are, driving that sense of community in some way or the other within this space of patient engagement. And that's really important for us to feel grounded, for us to feel like we're working towards common goals, for us to feel like this is a legitimate career and we don't, there is a sense of kinship with other people working in this space. I think that it also serves towards the goal of more pharma companies legitimizing this patient engagement as a function, and that ties into more and more regulators requiring patient involvement in medicines development. So we hope to see more pharma companies developing patient engagement functions, involving patients or patient engagement professionals in some form or the other in a professional capacity within their teams, and more of these communities gaining ground.
Totally agree. And it's great that these initiatives are ongoing and there's some clear movement in this space, and we can all get behind it as a community and make sure that it's delivered in the best way possible. And that'll be the best both for pharmaceutical businesses, but also for patients as well.
Thank you so much for listening today. This has been Not Just Patients with our guest, Emma Sutcliffe, and your hosts, Caitlin Rich and Clarinda Cerejo.